He came all the way from Canada to talk to you guys. So you guys can do better than that, right? Come on. All right.
Thank you, Nathan, for the blowing of the trumpet, and that's so appropriate to what I'm going to be talking about in a lot of aspects over the next couple of hours here. And for those of you, I don't know how many are familiar with me. I know everybody's familiar with Rob and David here. This is, I wrote a book about a year or so ago, and I've been out promoting it, and I don't have a platform, so I'm kind of a relative unknown. So I find it an absolute honor to be here working with Rob and David and with John and the whole Now UCTV crew and what they're doing here. And so I'm going to try and do my best to keep up with these guys because they are absolutely awesome. And I thought, David made such a terrific speech today and did a wonderful job in making his case. And in case you're wondering on the presentations, if you're going to see a lot of overlap, and you will, from what I heard from what David was talking about, we didn't get together and plan anything. But I think we'll give you some different looks to the sort of the same types of topics and sort of expand in different areas on that. So if you're not familiar with me, the book I wrote is Genesis 6 Conspiracy, How Secret Societies and the Descendants of Humankind and the descendants of giants plan to enslave humankind. So what I wanted to do with the book is create one narrative from Genesis to Revelation and connect more dots than anybody else has connected. And so I'm going to kind of keep with that theme here, where I'm going to give you a lot of information today, and I'm going to try and connect a lot of dots. Some of it might be contentious, but the whole process of what we're trying to do is increase the level of curiosity and research and working together in teams with ideas, as what David was doing with Satan and Lucifer and the King of Tyr today, is to understand more and get more people thinking on it to understand it. So some of the things I am going to talk about you may or may not agree with. That's fine. And my views tend to evolve as well. If somebody makes a case, and Rob was saying last night, my beliefs are only as solid as somebody can prove to me that scripturally I'm wrong, and at that point in time I'll change. Well, I believe in that too. So that's what it's all about. So moving on, you can see I've got a screen up behind me, yep, and everything seems to be working, and I've labeled my presentation Days of Darkness, Days of Light, and the Mystery of God. So you can see I'm going to take on just a few things without even telling you what's in it yet. And I'm going to be talking about the days of the trumpet. So that's why I'm thanking Nathan. And I don't think he knew that my presentation was on the days of the trumpet, and he's up here blowing the trumpet. So that's absolutely perfect. And I'm going to talk about prophecy markers. And you heard one of those today for sure with David with the Assyrian. And we're going to talk about trumpets, and we're going to talk about banners, and we're going to talk about the Assyrian, the mystery of God. We're going to talk about locusts and horses, and we're going to talk a lot about the days of the trumpet that goes from Revelation 9 to about 14. So, and then I'm going to connect this with the past and bring some interesting sort of sidebars in and update it, because I like to use the past to define what's going on in prophecy, because all prophecy is delivered through basically two sources, the prophets and Jesus. And one of the doctrines that I have that I like to stick to is I look to what Jesus said on everything first, and then assemble everything around what he said. So I go to the four Gospels first, and anything else, whether it's in Galatians or wherever in the Old Testament, I assemble it around that. The other thing I try and do, and I can't put everything up here today because I'd be here for all day, and I'd crowd everybody out on my presentation, is one of the other doctrines I like to do is whether it's a doctrine or it's a prophecy, I like to assemble every prophecy or item said about that doctrine or prophecy and try and get the whole story and base that around what Jesus said. So that's what we're going to do. And when we look at what Jesus is said to be in Revelation 19, it says Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. So that's one of the reasons I go right to Jesus, other than he's the Redeemer, other than he's the Word of God, and all Word of God comes from Jesus, then we should go to Jesus as our source. So without preaching too much, that's kind of where I'm going to be coming from. And we're going to see that when I talk about the days of darkness, we're going to see that there's also days of light. And there's significant days of light in the days of darkness. So we're going to shine a light on the dark days and what really happened before the flood. And how does it connect to Noah? Because, again, if we look to our Redeemer, the Word of God, the end time will be like the days of Noah. So we need to understand what happened in the times of Noah. We need to understand everything that happened. And we need to understand about things like the abyss, and was talked about earlier. We need to understand about angels. We need to understand about the NWO, and I like to call it the Nephilim world order, past and future and present. And as you probably learned, I'm a big fan of the bloodlines of the Nephilim. The technology that was going on in the antediluvian epoch, the level of that technology probably surpassed what we have today. And it's related to this sudden doubling, quadrupling, tripling of knowledge and technology that's happening at a pace unlike it's happened since the time of the flood, or at least beyond Babel. And so that's got a connection in here. Secret societies, which David is an absolute expert on. This secret society idea, if you don't understand it, Masonry goes back to the days of Noah. And it goes back to the evil Enoch, his descendants, and it goes back to Cain when they learned the 7 sacred sciences and took it to this level of technology and created mysticism, sun worship, and the secret societies to develop that technology and knowledge and advancements to honor the great architect of the universe called Lucifer, and I'm going to finish up on him. So just to connect a few dots on there for you. And I'm going to connect all this on how it connects to the days of the trumpet, because it's all very, very important, as you're going to see. And understand that the days of the trumpet happen after the opening of the seals, right? And that's very, very significant, because even at that point, we're into days of darkness, because 25% of the earth, 25% of the people are gone, even before we get into the trumpet, let alone the days of darkness of the trumpet. So a lot of things have been going on there, and then there's going to be a whole bunch of things going on in the days of the trumpet. Okay, and in the days of the trumpet, we have the 3 woes. So these are dark days. And it expands the days of the trumpet, Revelation 18 to 14. I think I said 9 earlier. And it's going to include things like World War III, locusts and horses, the rise and fall of Babylon, rise of the Antichrist, the return of Jesus, rapture, second Exodus, and of course the 3 woes. And does everybody know what the 3 woes are? Just to get everybody up to speed, I know it's a knowledgeable, but the first one is with what comes out of the abyss. So it's important to understand what the abyss is. The next one is World War III, and then the third one is the wrath bowls. Okay, those are the 3 woes. And again, if anybody wants those scriptures, I can get them to you, but they're fairly easily attainable out of Revelations. So the days of darkness and the days of light. And when I talked about all of those events, there's some really evil, bad things, and there's some really, really good things that we're going to talk about. So if we're going to talk about the days of the trumpet, we have to talk about the feasts, right, of the trumpet in particular. And if you want to understand the resurrection, you have to understand the Feast of Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. If you want to understand how things are going to unfold, you better know all of the Feasts of the Trumpets, and probably even the Feast of First Fruits, because that's part of the rapture event, right? Christ's first fruits. and then the rest. So let's understand and walk back and just get a quick understanding of the Feast of the Trumpets. And can everybody hear me in the background before I get too far? Sound is good? I don't need to be louder? Okay, good. So, on the Feast of Trumpets, it was on the 7th month they held a sacred assembly. And that's in Numbers 21. And it's a day for the Israelites to sound the trumpets. Of course, they didn't sound them on the outside of the city because of the Jericho event. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But the Feast of Trumpets in the 7th month, and hold a sacred assembly. And what's so important about the Feast of Trumpets? Well, a congregation would get together at that time in ancient Israel, and they would ask God to fulfill his promises committed in the Holy Covenant. We're going to talk about some of those promises that they're asking to be fulfilled when we get into some of the events of the days of the trumpet. And that was a tradition that they did. And they wanted the end time to be brought about so that those commitments could be fulfilled. And 10 days after the blowing of the trumpet comes the Day of Atonement, or Yom Kippur, as some people might know it today. And there's a connection there. And I'm going to make a connection for you on the Day of Atonement in a couple areas and its relationship to days and the 7 trumpets. And I'll come back to that. And so when we look at the Feast of the Trumpets, it has some ancient meanings. And if we look at Jericho as one example, is that it announced the destruction of the Nephilim world order, but it also announced the renewal of the covenant land. And in ancient times, that's what it meant. And in the end time, it means the same thing. So we're going to have the destruction of this Nephilim world order, the new world order, and everything about the world, and then we're going to be renewed again. And so again, symbolically, the days of the trumpet lays down so many significant undertows of meaning. We need to pay attention to it, and you're going to learn, and as I said earlier, is the trumpet is a significant prophetic marker, and I'm going to bring that up as we go. So just back on Jericho, I mean, they had 7 trumpets there, so we're seeing the same type of ritual, and it brought the walls down after walking around the city for 7 days. Well, that's why they never blew the trumpet outside the city of Jerusalem afterwards. There's probably a good reason for that. They probably didn't want the walls of Jerusalem to come tumbling down. And what's really interesting as being the destruction of the Nephilim order and the renewal of all things, we look at Revelation 10:7. And what we see going on there is there will be no more delay, but in the days when the 7th trumpet angel is about to sound his trumpet, the mystery of God is accomplished. And we're going to talk about what that mystery is. And when we look at the mystery of God as announced to his servants, the prophets. So we have to bring in the prophets to understand what's going on in the days of the trumpets. And we have to look very specifically to what Jesus said. Again, we're going to stick to this. I'm going to stick to the rules of what I normally like to do, and hopefully it resonates and has some meaning with you. So what was going on in the days of Noah? We had a lot of things going on there, right? So many different things, but just a quick sort of run through. You've got the flood, the first apocalypse by water, and the second apocalypse is by fire, and that's a constitutive doctrine in every mythology and every religion basically around the world. This is not an unknown idea or concept that's isolated to monotheism. Okay, so understand that the next apocalypse is going to be by fire, and Revelation will back that up significantly. We have the Nephilim world order, the rise of the giants to take the kingships, usurp the kingships, and enslave the antediluvian world, and they did so again after the flood. We have the seraphim angels that David was talking about, the watchers. And we have dragons and serpents, right? And if you don't think that these seraphim angels are related to seraphs, which is a type of snake and shows up in Isaiah, these guys had a face of a snake. Okay? And so did their offspring in the first few generations. And so that's why snake sort of iconography and imagery, as with the dragon, is so popular everywhere in the ancient world, right? And if you have a seraphim angel with wings, you've got an angelic dragon. If you have a snake in Eden, before its arms and legs are ripped off, you've got a four-legged, walking upright, and it did in other mythologies, dragon. And some of those ones had wings. So you had both a physical dragon in mythology of the antediluvian world and somewhat backed up in Eden, and you have the angelic dragon. That's why dragons are everywhere. And that's why they started all of these snake brotherhoods, that I like to call them in my book, because they're all brotherhoods of the snake looking for wisdom, and those symbols are always represented by a snake, which goes back to the seraphim angels, which goes back to Satan and Lucifer and whatever else you may want to call them based on what David was talking about this morning. We also have Azazel. We also have the abyss. We have the corruption of the earth. And we have the advanced high level of technology that was going on in the antediluvian world. So all of this is going to be taking place after the seals are open and into the days of the trumpet and then into the wrath bowl. So all of this is going to take place. So what is the abyss? And there's some conversations and some questions about that. I'm not going to deal with death and Hades. I'm going to deal with the abyss part here to keep the conversation as narrow as possible. And so in Greek, abyssos means basically a deep or bottomless pit, as most people would understand it. In 2 Peter, it talks about, and as well in Jude, it's a gloomy, dark prison where angels are hung, right? And these are the angels who had positions of authority. So when we talk about authority and kingship, it means rulers, and that's sort of what an archon was. If you look at other sort of translations, what a seraphim angel was, or a watcher. These were rulers of 7 cult centers of the antediluvian age. And again, I know that that's not in the Bible, but you get that more of the 7 mountains in Enoch, and then as you get through the other testimonies, as I like to call them, or witnesses from a different polytheist perspective of the same events. And when we look at what comes out of the abyss, there's going to be crowns there too. So we have to recognize that there might be a parallel there. And then, of course, as it was mentioned earlier in David's session, is the abyss is also called Tartarus in one of the translations. And not one of the translations, in one of the 2 verses that I quoted, and this one being 2 Peter. And Tartarus is in Greek mythology is the place where the rebellious Titans were imprisoned and were kept there even after the destruction of the antediluvian world. And in their belief system, they escaped out of Tartarus to repopulate the world afterwards. And I just find it interesting that repopulate the world with giants. Let's be clear on that. That's their belief. That's not what the Bible says, but I just find it interesting that Abyss and Tartarus are tied together, and that's really the only area that I see Tartarus connected there. And if you've noticed, we were talking about snake societies. That's a question mark up there, and the reason why I left that, if I put that in bold, it goes back to a normal question mark. This is an Apple product, but in a question mark, in the normal sort of text, in this particular style of text, at least, it looks like a snake, and I'm thinking, that's really strange, but I'm going to use it. So what is the abyss? It's a place in Enoch, just for a little more context, that's darker than any earthly darkness. And it's in the second heaven, and it's where angels are hung in a place of judgment. And it's a place of darkness where no light gets in. And it's a place of fire and ice. And I find that interesting that those two things can exist out of the normal state of physics in a prison designed for beings out of the normal state of physics, right? So I find that kind of plausible, but I don't find that a very fuzzy, warm place type of thing. I'm sure it's warm, and I'm sure it's cold. I don't think I would want to call it home. Going on in Enoch, who's in the abyss? Well, they put the leader of the watchers there, plus the other impassioned fallen angels, and likely some of the more horrific demons, or the more horrific bodiless giants, the original Nephilim, the ones who did the worst things in the antediluvian time. So that's who's likely in the abyss, and that's what's likely going to come out. But Azazel is in the abyss, and it's a place of Dudael. And that's kind of interesting because Dudael is a place of darkness in the desert. And so desert would be the Dudae part, and El is God, right? So you have a couple sort of connections there where you can call it the cauldron of God that some people do, or the desert of God. And that's a very, very important aspect to relate back to the feasts and the holy days of ancient Israel. And it was alluded to a little bit earlier with David. But I want to talk and convict Azazel a little bit more. And not only was he the leader, but he helped in his order to corrupt the whole earth. And we normally understand that to mean there was violence in the earth, and we normally don't really expand that to everything. I think that they corrupted the whole earth, and certainly Enoch would suggest that. And that means they corrupted through DNA manipulation, gene manipulation, the plants, the animals, hybrids like crazy, different beings, and that the whole world was corrupted from the original creation. And that was sort of the totality of the sin, let alone the rebellion that took place, that the Nephilim and of that time rebelled against God. And they joined up with the secret societies and the mystical religions, and they joined up to enslave humankind. And they almost succeeded, save for the family of Noah and the apocalypse of water and a new start for humanity. So what do you think they're trying to do in the end time? Why do you think that they look at us, secret societies or the descendants, as cattle? They want to cattle herd us in a direction, and they'll slaughter us en masse in the end time. These will be days of darkness. We will stand strong against them for as long as we're here, but they don't consider us worthy. We are subhuman to them, and they don't even really necessarily consider themselves human. They consider themselves as being a higher level of being and trying to evolve into gods. And we're not worthy to evolve in gods because we believe in God and we believe in Jesus. Okay? So understand the days of the darkness and what they're going to do. And we're going to talk about some inside out that they're going to do at the end of the presentation. And if you want to, I'm sure everybody's probably familiar with some of the DNA manipulation or something that they did in the antediluvian world. If you look at a cyclops, right? And if you look at the serum, which is some sort of goat god being, you've got centaurs, you've got Pegasus, you've got over in India, elephant-faced gods, you've got multi-hand gods. There's a whole bunch of different things going on that we can sort of point towards, whether it's in mythology or Bible related that this technology was able to corrupt the world in manners that we're only starting to be able to do now. So that's why it's so much like the days of Noah. And Azazel is spelled two different ways. You might know it as Azaziel or Azazel. But when we look at Leviticus, it uses Azazel, and when we look at Enoch, it uses Azazel. I don't care which form is used, but I just wanted to note that's why I've got two different forms there. And in Leviticus, we talked about this Day of Atonement, that there are two goats that are separated. One for the scapegoat, for this who's charged for the sins of the antediluvian world. All of it is hung on Azazel. So he is the scapegoat. And that's why scapegoat and Azazel is used as the second goat on the Day of Atonement and sent to be released into the desert as a sacrifice and goes back to Dudael again. So again, nice little connection there. And as I said earlier, is the Day of Atonement happens 10 days after the Feast of Trumpets. So all of this is connected, and we understand trumpets as destruction and renewal. So this is going to play in a prophetic way, in a way that perhaps you haven't thought about down the road. Now, what's interesting about this individual, this seraphim angel, this watcher, this Grigori, this archon, is he is referred to in Jewish tradition as the ruler of desolation, which is the abyss. And he's related to the Serim, the goat god that we talked about, something that looks awfully similar to the pan god that Jesus announced to in the New Testament. And when I talk about what he announced to it was establishing Peter as his rock. And he's in Philippi, Caesarea, and there's a Pan temple that he went to announce that afterwards. So then again, that's not a coincidence. And when we look at this foster he-goat, that is why two goats are used on the Day of Atonement, right? Because Azazel is the scapegoat. And this is the sacrifice. And the goat is a significant aspect of occultism, right? So you have the goat of Mendes, or the Chem of Mendes, the goat of alchemy, because Mendes and the goat of the black sciences is about alchemy and the religion of Egypt. And so he's also the goat that's used in the pentagram. So Azazel has a significant position in occultism, and therefore in mysticism, and therefore in secret societies, because they're all related. It's all the same type of organization. So let's go back to the abyss again. And back to Enoch. So what it says in Enoch is the fallen angels and the watchers, or the sons of the watchers, the children of the watchers, are going into the abyss. And it also says in this verse that the abyss is located somewhere in the valley of the earth. Okay? And it sounds like there is two abysses. Okay? Because if we look at it, there's one where they're being locked into, and then there's another one for judgment. So it gives us a little bit more information, and I'll come back to this a little bit later. I'm just laying some of the groundwork for the abyss down the road and into Revelation. And the angel of the abyss comes out of a shaft in Revelation. Okay? So if you have an abyss of fire, and now in Revelation we understand there's a shaft, it's almost like there's two compartments to this abyss. And it also sounds like it's a little bit separate from death and Hades, right? But understand this prison is probably right beside the abyss, and it sounds like it's in the earth. So there seems to be two parts to the abyss. And what's really interesting about this shaft is this is where these really weird locusts that are kind of like horses come out. And I'm going to have to spend a little bit of time on that part of it, because this is the first part of the days of the trumpet. So, locusts, horses, and trumpets. Okay, so locusts, when we look at how they're used in Scripture, they're instruments of God's wrath. And we see that, and I've listed a whole bunch of things up, verses up there, where you can go and look up. They're used, like in the Exodus and places like that, as an instrument of God's wrath. So very, very appropriate for the end time, whatever the meaning of these locusts are. And locusts tend to typify in Jeremiah an invading army. And we also learn about locusts in Joel, where they're compared to horses. So there's a relationship here between the horses and the locusts. And the locusts come out of the abyss in 9:3. Okay, and then Job lays down a little bit more of a connection in defining the connection of a horse, and it leaps like a locust in battle, and when the trumpet sounds, he snorts and he's ready for battle. So again, I'm just sort of knitting together that locusts and horses somehow is related to invading massive armies. And of course, I noticed that it mentioned trumpets there twice. And again, I think there's a significance to that meaning in how that's laid out. But that's not a prophetic, that's just a defining aspect and making a connection. I don't believe the Bible puts words together coincidentally. I believe it is specifically, determinedly accurate. So we need to pay attention what's being written all of the time. Okay, so let's now move to Joel 2. And here we understand that there's a trumpet being blown in Zion. And I'm going to tell you right now that a trumpet, anytime you see a trumpet, that's prophetic. And this is prophetic of World War III, of an invading army into Israel, the modern day state of Israel, that's going to connect a time frame for you. You're going to see trumpets come up a lot as a prophetic marker. So walk away with that with a little bit of confidence. At least my conclusions are is trumpets are a prophetic marker. And what it tells us is it's a day of clouds and blackness, and there's an invading army, and they have appearance of horses, and a noise like that of chariots. And it's a very kind of strange war where they go up and they eat up all of the land, and they devour the vegetation. So this is important language. It's a little bit sort of allegorical, what we think, but you're going to find out it's not all that allegorical other than what's already been defined, what we talked about in the verses in the past couple of slides. So if we go to Revelation 9, and we see what comes out of the abyss, we see something similar. Maybe not quite the same, but we see something similar. But these locusts are a little bit different than what's being described in Joel. So that's why people tend not to sort of make a linkage here between Joel and the locusts in the days of the trumpet and coming out of the abyss. And I'm going to make some differences, and then I'm going to make a linkage here for you. So these ones coming out of the abyss, what's different about them is they have stingers like scorpions, and that's not in Joel. These ones torture people for 5 months and with those stingers, and death does not come to these people who are stung by them, right? Well, there's a lot of people slaughtered in World War III. So again, there's a distinction and there's something different going on here. And these locusts are instructed not to harm the land, but in Joel, they eat the vegetation and absolutely eat it up and destroy it. So again, there's something a little different that's going on here. And this is, of course, the first woe with these locusts coming up out of the abyss. Okay? And what Joel is talking about is the second woe. And so understand that as part of the difference. Okay, so Revelation 9 still. We're talking about these locusts coming out of the abyss. And these ones have crowns, signifying authority that we talked about a little while ago. And the crowns of gold, and they have human faces. So I'm thinking that these are either Nephilim king demons, or they are seraphim fallen angels, rulers, or archons, or whatever you want to call them, of the cult centers of the antediluvian epoch. They have lion's teeth like what Joel has in his. They have breastplates of iron, which is different than what Joel is talking about. But it's similar, but there's something different here than what's going on in World War III. So now if we move on a little bit later into what seems to be related to what's going on with these horses, they're now a little bit more like locusts. And in Revelation 9:15-19, this is now very similar to Joel. And these are different than the locusts that came up out of the abyss. So what am I talking about in here is now we have an army that's like in Joel. We have 200 million people. Right? 200 million people in this army. And Joel's going to have something very interesting to say about that you might find surprising. They have heads of lions, and 1/3 of the people and 1/3 of the earth are destroyed. We already lost 25%. And now we're going to lose 1/3 to this different type of locust horse. This is World War III, and this is the second woe. So let's go back to Joel. Okay. So again, we see the lion, the fangs of a lioness, so lining up there. And what we see, it says, blow a trumpet. This is the days of the trumpet, some of the trumpet plagues. And a large and mighty army comes forward. That was never of old and won't be again. So if this is the army of Joel, then that means what happens at Armageddon is a smaller army than this. So how horrific is this before the wrath comes? This is World War III of destruction and days of darkness beyond our understanding, and it causes the sun and the moon and the stars in all of these trumpet blasts coming out up to just to this level, to the second woe, to go dark. These are days of darkness. Okay? And things are deteriorating quickly. Blow the trumpet in Zion. I don't believe that that's a coincidence. I just don't believe the Bible works in coincidences. So let's move over to Ezekiel. Let's bring Ezekiel in. And this is the Magog war that we're talking about. What's interesting about Magog and Gog, they are known as giants in other mythologies. And in Greek and giants that were in England in their mythology, there's three main ones, Gog, Magog, and Albion. But these are the giants that came out of Tartarus that we talked about in that mythology. And what's interesting about these giants that are told in mythology and on the names of these giants is they're named Gog and Magog, Celtes, Scythes, Galatea, Galantis, Keltos, Galas. These are all giants that are parents of this Scythian people that the descendants of Japheth married into. So probably married into giants, and probably accepted the names of Gog and Magog, similar to what happened with the Amalekites and so much of what else happened with the Nephilim order. And what's so interesting about this war, you have Masesh, which is the root word for Moscow, and you have the Scythians, which are tracked back to the Slavic nations, and this is Russia coming up out of the north in how so many people understand. I know there's some different people that understand this differently, but understand that it's so interesting that it is giant references with Russia, World War III, going into the Middle East, and again, we're going to have, at the end of the millennium, Gog and Magog rising up in rebellion again. So how important is it to understand what happened with the giants and all the interrelationships? It just may give you a little bit more context to understanding what was going on. And in this war, We understand that it is a great alliance of nations like Togarmah and Tubal and so many nations with them. And it's a great horde. Well, how does that line up with what Joel is saying in Israel? And this army is invading Israel. And then with the trumpets, 200 million people. This is World War III. This is happening before the midpoint of the last 7 years, whether or not you want to call it a tribulation period or not my concern. All I know is at the midpoint of the end time is 3.5 years into it, so that's half of 7 years. So let's continue a little bit more with Ezekiel, because I'm going to get some more nice little relationships here for you. And we go further on into Ezekiel 38. We understand that there is going to be a large earthquake in the land of Israel. And he will pour down torrents of rain and hailstones and burning sulfur on him, on Gog, and the many troops and the nations with them. It's going to destroy that army. It's going to fight for Israel, or the Judeans, or the people living in Judah, however you want to recognize the people in Judah today. Okay? And what's interesting is in Revelation 11:19, in the days of the trumpet, guess what? There's a great earthquake and hailstorm is being poured out. So how much of that is an interesting connection to World War III? And in Revelation 9:17 and 19, we understand that a third of the people are killed by fire and sulfur and smoke, which is what Joel was talking about, and this is the war that causes it. So days of the trumpet, days of darkness. Now, if we were to read a little bit further on, and I'm just going to tie this in, and then I'm going to come back, so remember this one for later. It says, when I have brought them back from the nations and gathered them from the countries of their enemies, I will show myself holy through them, spelling error there, it should be them, not then, in the sight of many nations. For though I sent them into exile among the nations, I will gather them to their own land, not leaving any behind. I'm going to come back to this. This is in 39. This is at the end of World War III, towards the midpoint of the tribulation is sort of the timetable. I'm going to connect that timetable for you. So understand this. This is part of the days of light. This is part of the mystery of God that we're going to be talking about. But they are exiled, but they are not forgotten. So they're obviously talking a little bit more than about the people in Judea, the people of Israel today. Talking about people that aren't forgotten. And now they're going to be gathered. So let's finish up with the locusts and the trumpets in World War III. So the seventh angel sounded his trumpet, and there came flashes of lightning, rumblings, and an earthquake, and a great hailstorm. And I just put that in there just to underline that that is in the days of the trumpet, and it is a description of Joel and Ezekiel in World War III. And then afterwards, we have the gathering, and at a time that Jesus noted specifically. Because Jesus will define this for you. You just have to look for it. It's the time of the abomination. And so whether I'm using Matthew 24, but I could use Mark. I use Luke. Doesn't matter. I'm using Matthew. And so when you see standing in the holy place, and the abomination is going to happen, then let those who are in Judea understand and flee to the mountains. So at a point in time when the World War III is coming to the end, the Antichrist is invading the land of Israel at the midpoint of the tribulation, or the midpoint of the last 7 years, at the timing of the abomination. Those who are saved in Judea, they know they need to flee to the desert. And they're going to be protected there for the last 3.5 years. That's not a coincidence. He is telling us something, and I'm going to connect that a little bit more here for you. And it happens in the days of the trumpet. So he moves on shortly thereafter, and he talks about lightning that comes from the east is visible, and in the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. I'm going to define that as a banner. And I'm going to come back to that. This is going to be important in terms of timing and recognizing prophecy markers. So immediately after those days, what happens? The sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. These are the days of the trumpet that we're talking about. And it aligns with World War III. And after that, after those days, he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other. And I'm going to suggest to you is between the abomination and this, they're talking about two different events. But they're talking about events happening at the same time. One is an exodus, and one is a rapture. And I'm going to define that for you as we go forward, because it is such an interesting thing to understand, and Jesus is telling us the order of that's going to happen. Because the abomination and the fleeing happens, right, after World War III, and now we have this trumpet sound and the gathering of the elect from the four corners. Okay, let's just do a quick double check to make sure that we understand what our timing is from a different perspective. Daniel 9, and of course Daniel and Revelations, as everybody in this room knows, they go together pretty darn well. And so what's interesting, why I pulled Daniel 9, is he will confirm a covenant with many for 7. And then in the middle of the 7, that's when the sacrifice ends and the abomination has. So that's why I like to use 7 years, and I don't care whether you... No, it's not that I don't care. That's a bad way of saying it. Whether or not you want to call it a tribulation period or just 7 years, your choice. I want to be very respectful of people's views. I didn't mean to be so judgmental there. My apologies. And then further in Daniel 12, okay, and after the abomination, there will be 1,290 days and an additional 45 days afterwards. So we're talking just over 3.5 years after the abomination when the wrath is going to come. Okay, so I think we're in sync, and if we look in Revelation, that's going to back us up at the same point in time on the rule of the Antichrist of being 1,260 days or 3.5 years, depending on what translation you're looking at, right? So, and that's the time from the abomination forward. So what's nice is all of the prophecies, and there's more I could lay out here, they all line up kind of nicely if we start to look at them together. And what's interesting as we go further on into the New Testament is we get some other testimonies that are reaffirming that what Jesus had talked about. So we're assembling around what Jesus said. That's key. And when you look at 2 Thessalonians, it's really kind of interesting because we get an order of events just as Jesus was talking about. The day of the Lord occurs when the rebellion occurs. That's the abomination, the taking of the mark, the allegiance, to fight for their freedom, that they're going to be told to stand with the Antichrist and with Lucifer or Satan. And based on this morning, I'm not sure which way I should call it, but I'll talk a little bit about that later. And that's the rebellion. Okay, then the Antichrist is revealed. We're going to recognize him. He's going to be introduced as he negotiates the covenant of death. And I know people don't like to call it the covenant of death, but I'm going to tell you that I believe it is, and I'm going to show you how that connects as the covenant of death for 7 years. And when God annuls that covenant of death, and when that happens, timing is perfect, as usual in the Bible. Okay, so that's the introduction when he negotiates the covenant and then starts his rise to become Antichrist. And then he is revealed at the abomination and when he sets himself up to be God in the temple. So that is the order according to what Paul says in 2 Thessalonians. And Paul is very clear on that. Okay, so let's look at Corinthians and just do another double check. And again, what we find in Corinthians is what Jesus said. No surprise. And understand it based on what Jesus said. At least that's my approach. Because these are the days, part of the days of light and the mystery of God. So it'd be nice to understand this and get it right. And again, as I said earlier, we're trying to pool information to try and get it right. Which is why these types of conferences are just so very important. And we talk about Christ, the first fruits, again, Feast of Fruits. I would encourage people to go back and read all of the feasts of God and start to understand that in a larger term than just rituals that people of Israel did. They were important because it's part of our whole period that we're here and where we're going. So the first fruits, and then when he comes, then the end will come. And when the end comes, that's the wrath of God. Okay? That's what people will be saved from, is the wrath of God, or at least part of the wrath of God, but not necessarily from everything. And we see two different persecutions in Revelation and Revelation. We have the saints in the it's close, similar. We see the saints persecuted in the days of the seal openings. And then we have those being persecuted in after the abomination, and Daniel backs that up. So there's two different genocides, two different holocausts going on. And it scares me that we might get the timing wrong, and how our testimony would be shamed if we got it wrong. And therefore, what happens to us is we're standing up and saying, Antichrist, 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 please rapture, and it doesn't happen. So I would love, I'm not, for me, I hope it's pre-trib. But for me, and I'm going to lay a case out here, is I don't think it is. I think we need to be prepared for that, because we don't want to let people down, because our testimony is going to be so strong. And it has to be so strong, and it's so much required in these days of darkness to turn them into as much of the days of light that it needs to be. And what's really important here is in 15:51 to 52, at the last trumpet, for the trumpet will sound, the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will be changed. The trumpet again, the days of the trumpet. And if it was just this amount of trumpets in prophecy and relating to this period as markers, I could accept the argument, okay, just nice language. But it's not a coincidence, and you're going to see more and more trumpets as I continue to go through. Now, you heard David talk about Sorry, David. I wasn't going to insult you or anything. Yeah, the light comes on. So, how's that doing for the broadcast? Is that okay? The light? Okay. So, we're going to visit Revelation 12 again, and this is the time when the dragon has been hurled to the earth, and something interesting happens. And I listened intently on the three floods. I'm going to give you a different look at what's going on with this river, and maybe suggest to you that it's not a flood. But I'm not offside with David in terms of what he was saying in terms of Satan and Lucifer, because I think he made a good case. And I'm going to touch on some of that as I go through, and I'm going to sort of wing that as I go, because I learned that today from him. Even though I kind of realized a little bit of it, I certainly didn't have the guts to try and make that case. So thank you, David. You showed me that I need to continue to be even more of a contrarian. Okay. So, very interesting language here. This is during the days of the last trumpet. Trumpets go to Revelation 14. It's before the bowls of wrath. And in Revelation 11:15, let me back that up a little bit. Let me go back to Revelation 12. So when we look at here, what we're talking about is some interesting language of two wings of a great eagle. She might fly to a place prepared for her in the desert. Judea goes to the desert. We talked about that at the time of the abomination. So we have connection here. And what happens at that time is the serpent spewed water like a river to overtake the woman and sweep her away like a torrent. I think what it's talking about, and you're going to see this come out a little bit more, is that whether it is a creation of a river from the dragon's mouth actually, or it comes out of the earth's reservoirs, or it's the dam system on the Euphrates rivers, I think there's going to be this flooding of the people of Israel running to the desert, and that he's going to try and destroy Israel. But God saves the people living in Israel at that time, and then the dragon becomes enraged, and now he makes war with the rest of the saints, the rest of the offspring, those who obey God's commandments and hold to the testimony of Jesus, right? So he can't get Israel, but he can go after other believers, the Gentiles. Mystery of the river, mystery of the water like a river. Let's look at Isaiah. Okay, this is in the days of the trumpet, the time of the abomination. In that day the Lord will thresh from the flowing Euphrates, or river, note A, to the wadi of Egypt, and you, O Israelites, will be gathered up one by one. This is after World War III. This is talking about a gathering. This is the time of the abomination. This is when Judea flees to the desert. This water starts to overflow. And in that day, a trumpet will sound. So I don't think that trumpet is a coincidence. I don't think the river is a coincidence. I don't think the gathering is a coincidence. Just too many things are tying together here. And in Exodus 19, we understand it as an exodus because on the wings of an eagle is used in the first Exodus. And I don't think that language is coincidental. This is an exodus. And I'm going to suggest to you it's larger than the people fleeing from Judea in the days of the trumpet. Okay, let's look a little bit more at Isaiah. Again, when an overwhelming scourge sweeps by, hail will sweep away your refuge. Okay? Time of the trumpets, hail. Another key marker. Water will overflow your hiding place. Your covenant of death will be annulled. That 7-year arrangement that Daniel talks about, it is now being annulled. When? When Daniel says in the middle of the 7, and Isaiah, in my opinion, is calling it a covenant of the death at the timing of the abomination and the fleeing to Judea to the desert. When an overwhelming scourge sweeps by, it will carry you away. So a physical water of some sort, not just an allegory. Probably real water, probably a real river. And the understanding of this message will bring sheer terror. Why? It's the last trumpet. And now come the bowl wrath and the end time and the wrath of God. It should, if you understand this message, tell you that this is the time of God's wrath. The message brings sheer terror. I don't know how to underline that more. I don't read that anywhere else. Let's look at Zechariah. The Lord will appear. The Lord will appear over them. We talked about Matthew and this light shining from the ends of the earth that essentially everybody will see. The Lord will sound the trumpet. The Lord will sound the trumpet. Jesus said, trumpet will be blown and a banner, or you'll be able to see him all over the earth. And the Lord their God will save them on that day as the flock of his people. He's going to gather his flock. Gather his flock in 2 ways, rapture and in second Exodus, and in the times of the trumpet. And this is part of the mystery of God. These are part of the days of light coming out of the darkness. Back to Isaiah for, again, more on this river. Because I want to make sure that people understand the timing and the understanding, what's going on in Revelation 12. Isaiah 43 says, I have summoned you by name. God remembers everybody. He's going to summon them by name, whether it's rapture or it's Exodus. When you pass through the waters, so this is specifically about that river at the time of Judea and the river spewed by the dragon. Will not sweep over you. When you walk through fire, so they're also going to be trying to attack Judea, and I'm going to introduce Israel as well at this point. From wherever they are traveling to the desert, they're going to be attacked, but they're going to be protected. And he's going to bring his sons from afar and my daughters from the ends of the earth. So this is more than just the people of Judea going. So you can make an argument, okay, it's the people of Judah, the 3 tribes of the southern kingdom from around the world. I agree with that, and that's going to happen, but it's more still. It's about Israel as well. And what's interesting is what it's saying here is Jesus will be with them. And how the Jewish people will believe is it's their Messiah. And we understand it more than the Messiah. It's the Redeemer. It's the Word of God, right? Jesus is going to be with them as they pass through the waters, and he will protect them. Micah chirps in. Jesus gathers Jacob and Israel. So if you're trying to understand prophecy, separate Judah from Jacob, Joseph, and Israel. Apply prophecy to Jacob, Joseph, Ephraim, and Israel to the northern kingdom. Apply prophecies to Judah to the southern kingdom and the people identified with them. So in Judah, you've got a little bit of Simeon, not much. There's some Simeon in Israel. That's a bit of a misinformation as to about Simeon, but the major ones are Levi, Benjamin, and Judah, right? The southern kingdom. Okay, and in Micah, Jesus breaks away the opening. So he is leading them in the front. He will walk before them. It says the king will pass through before them, the Lord at their head. I mean, how wonderful will that be for the people who are alive to be led and protected by our Redeemer? How wonderful is that? Okay. So you're starting to see how, and there's so many more prophecies I could put that will say the same thing and have the same type of markers, but you're starting to see how everything sort of starts to fit together if you let it, if you just permit it. Back to Isaiah, one of the greatest of the prophets, no doubt about it. And just for timing, in terms of this one, notice that Jesus made my mouth like a sharpened sword. So this is when this is talking to you about the allegories in Revelation and the time of Revelation. So just as a marker, I wanted to point that out just so that people know we're talking about the same thing when we're looking at Isaiah 49. And his servant will bring Jacob back to him and gather him to Israel to himself. It's too small a thing for him to just restore the lost tribes of Israel. And if people don't know the history, the lost tribes were taken in captivity to Assyria in 721 BC, somewhere there, 3 years this way, 3 years that way, and into enslavement. And from there, they were sold into slavery around the world and lost. Okay? That's important to remember. But also, in this prophecy, and it's linking it, and this is not a coincidence. We're talking about when Jesus will bring back Jacob from around the world, bring back Israel, a light for the Gentiles, because it's not enough just for Israel. Also a light for the Gentiles. And a light for the Gentiles connection there tells me that this is also the time of the rapture, because Jesus only comes once before Armageddon, right? On the second coming. He comes for rapture, and then he comes for Armageddon. So this is got to be at that same time. And all the details of rapture and all the details of second Exodus that I'm talking about, they all have to fit, right? if they're saying another story and it doesn't fit or it doesn't somehow slide in neatly, then something's wrong. But this is telling me that in all the other prophecies is that everything fits. And from the ends of the earth, from the four corners of the earth, so to speak. And then I really like this from Ezekiel 37. Okay, just before the Gog war, right? So take a stick of wood and write on it, belonging to Judah and the Israelites associated with him, just as I was saying, the southern kingdom. Then take another stick of wood and write on it, Ephraim, stick belonging to Joseph, and all of the house of Israel associated with him, the northern kingdom. Join them together into one stick. Bring them back together. Okay? Take this stick, which is Ephraim's hand, and of the Israelite tribes associated with them, and they will become one in God's hand and in Jesus' hands. So he will gather them from all around and bring them back to their own land. So this time of Judah, the people in Judea fleeing to the desert, is also the time of Israel and the tribes associated with them to be gathered back to the desert and protected in the time of the wrath for 3.5 years. And back in Revelation 12, it said that Judah will be protected, as I recall, for 1,260 days from the wrath, and at the time when the dragon spews the river. So again, you see all of this working neatly, hand in hand. And servant David will be king over them. So Ezekiel fits well. Let's move back to Micah. I'm going to mix in, and the Assyrian was talked about today. I'm going to talk a fair bit here about the Assyrian, and this is the time of the Assyrian and how important it is, and have something that's kind of similar and dovetails into what David was saying earlier. So Micah chips in here, and I want to point out he will deliver us from the Assyrian. That is also the Antichrist, right? No matter what else we're going to say that he is and who he is, he's also going to be the Antichrist, and I'm going to lay that out for you down the road. And they're going to be raised 7 shepherds, maybe 8 leaders. So what does that mean? Well, in Jewish tradition, they're going to raise up 7 famous shepherds to help in the Exodus. And the 8th might be the Messiah, might be Jesus, or it might be someone else that's interesting. But there's going to be 7, even 8 leaders. And that time they're going to deliver them from the Assyrian, from the Antichrist, right? From the time of the wrath. When he invades our land, when he moves in with his army, he takes over the temple in Jerusalem after the abomination. Then the remnant of Jacob will be among the nations, the lost tribes of Israel, in the midst of many peoples. And your hand will be lifted up in triumph over your enemies. A banner. Doesn't say banner, but I'm going to come back to banners. We're not done with banners yet. All your foes will be destroyed in that day. That day, the time of the wrath. The time when Israel will be gathered from the nations. So Micah connects back to Revelation. So let's have a look at that. And back to the days of the trumpet. So if we look at Micah 5, Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel. Okay, we know that. That's Messiah, that's Jesus, whose origins are from old and from ancient times. Therefore Israel will be abandoned until the time when she who is in labor gives birth. Israel will be in labor until she who gives birth. Where does that line come from? Revelation 12, where the woman gives birth to Jesus. Right? Micah is connecting Revelation 12 with the lost tribes. And it talks also about that Israel was abandoned, and Israel will now be redeemed. for 1,260 days. Revelation 12, 1 to 17. I would really encourage people to have a closer look at what was going on with that river and the timing, and connect it to the abomination, connect it to the trumpets, and connect it to the timing of the rapture and the first return of Jesus all at once. And God remembers his covenant forever. We've heard of the Holy Covenant that was created at the time of the Exodus, correct? Well, this was all put into the Holy Covenant. This was known from the beginning, from the creation of Israel. And it will happen at the fulfillment of the mystery of God at the end time. I mean, how perfect is that? And how do we know that? Well, let's look at Deuteronomy 30, where it applies to it. And what it says is that the second Exodus, God will gather you again from all the nations where he scattered you, from the most distant lands from under heaven. From there, the Lord your God will gather you and bring you back. Who? The Lord your God. Jesus will bring them back. He will lead the second Exodus. Let there be no doubt about it, and it was said from the beginning of the covenant. And Israel had a choice, and Judah had a choice, even before they split. They could have fulfilled the Holy Covenant and our age if they had followed the laws. They would have been fulfilled through the blessings of the covenant. But they didn't. And so, whether or not they fulfilled the covenant or not, God's will always be fulfilled. And so it's fulfilled through the curses of the covenant. And God knew that they would fall away, but even if they didn't, he would still overcome, because God is greater than our free choice. And he overcomes our free choice for us. That's his great part of his grace. It's an amazing sort of understanding when you tie all of this together. And this happens all in the days of darkness. And linking back in Revelation 10:7, but in the days when the seventh angel is about to sound his trumpet, the mystery of God will be accomplished. The times of the seventh trumpet, the mystery of God will be accomplished. And just as announced by his prophets. Exactly how it was announced by his prophets. And defined by Jesus in the four Gospels. So, Isaiah 11. A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. Well, we know who that is. Okay? And in that day, the root of Jesse will stand as a banner. Now we're going to define the banner a little bit. Okay? And the Lord will reach out his hand a second time to reclaim the remnant that is left of his people. He will assemble the scattered people of Judah from the four quarters of the earth. So we're talking about second Exodus at the time of the Assyrian again. Okay? And I want to just spend a little bit of time on this. Oh, screwing up here. Try this again. There we go. Back working again. So when we talk about the mystery of God at the time of the trumpets, let's look at Ephesians 3, 4 to 6. The mystery through the gospel of the Gentiles. Both are heirs, Israel and Gentiles in Christ. So isn't it perfect that the rapture and the Exodus will happen at the same time? Romans 11, 19 to 26. We do not support the root supports us. If the root isn't holy, neither is the branch. Israel is not forgotten. They will wake up. They will remember who they are. They will begin to follow God. They will be Exodus, and they will be saved at the time of the rapture. And Israel was hardened so the full number of the Gentiles could come in, because we're joint heirs. And through the curses, even though that's not the way they could have done it, They suffered the curse because they didn't fulfill the Holy Covenant obligations, so that we as Gentiles can be brought in our full number. It's quite a price to pay by Israel for us. And Jesus comes to take away the sins of Israel. That's what Romans says. At the time of the Exodus. Okay, so let's move on to a little bit on the Assyrian. And we talk about the Assyrian as the rod of God's anger or the club of his wrath, and that's what David was talking about. So again, we know that the Assyrian and the Antichrist are the same. This is going to be at the time of the wrath. And on that day, he will crush the Assyrian on his land, and David covered that off earlier. On the mountaintops, I will trample him. Assyrian is the Antichrist. We need to understand this. And in Isaiah 30, again for timing, the Lord will come with his raging anger and consuming fire with cloudburst, thunderstorm, and hail, and the voice of the Lord will shatter Assyria with his scepter. So again, this is the time of the Assyrian, is the time of the wrath, is the time of the trumpets when Jesus comes, and then the time of the wrath, that's when he brings out the scepter. And also one from Nineveh. Okay, so when we talk about Nineveh and Assyrian, understand that we're talking about the same thing. And one who plots evil against the Lord and counsels wickedness. So again, just a little bit more evidence that the Assyrian is accurate sort of allegory for describing who the Antichrist is in the end time from an Old Testament perspective. And in Isaiah 10, we understand that this Assyrian will be punished, but what's more important here is the willfulness of his heart and the haughty look in his eyes. Well, if we look at Daniel and we look to Revelation, this will be a beast. It will slander God like beasts do, like angels are fearful to do, because they use Nephilim and humans to do their dirty work, because angels know the power of God. But they can fool us. And so this Antichrist person is going to be somebody who is proud and haughty and will slander God. And also what's interesting here is this guy removes the boundaries of the nations. This is a part of the covenant of death. This is the New World Empire. There are no borders, right? So an interesting little connection there. And he'll plunder the treasures of others. And then Daniel says he will redistribute it to the people who are with him. And this is a reference to the 7 of the 10 who help overflow the Babylon institution and religion and city of that time. And what's interesting about that is he'll make Obama's redistribution look like child's play. And what's so interesting about that is this is, again, sort of suggesting a left-wing progressive type of Nazi government. And again, that is not used loosely, because progressivism is Nazism, National Socialism, oligarchies, ends up in dictatorship. It's the same sort of belief system. So look for the end time to be a Nazi revitalization of the end time. They won't call it quite the same, I don't think, because it's got such a horrible understanding, but National Socialism is Nazism. That's what it stands for. It's not right-wing, it's left-wing. Okay, moving on to Revelation 14. And we're just talking a little bit about Babylon. And again, this is in the time frame of the trumpets. So the fall of Babylon is in the time of the trumpets. So this can be days of darkness or days of light, but it's going to be destruction, and finally Babylon is destroyed. And what we learn here is that not only is it in the days of the trumpet, but it's destroyed by the Antichrist and the 10 who join with the Antichrist to overthrow Babylon. So Babylon will be controlling the 10-nation empire of that time. And I believe the 10 nations aren't one nation. They are groups of nations. They're trading blocks, economic zones, spheres of influence, however you want to call that. But they are groups of nations. They are empires. And they will have one representative. And this is called for by the secret societies. And the Club of Rome's major agenda is to establish the 10-nation empire of the end time. And why do they want to do that? They're trying to recreate the Atlantean empire, which had 10 nations in it. So they're trying to create the new Atlantis that Francis Bacon talked about, with a universal religion that works in harmony with science, which is polytheism and Gnosticism, and which is the Royal Society's sort of goal and agenda, to bring about what happened in the days of old, before the flood, to be like what it's going to be in the end time. So again, all of this is working hand in hand. And what's interesting about the timing as we look at Revelation 14, it says, if anybody worships the beast and his image and receives his mark, then they're going to receive out of the full strength out of the cup of God's wrath. So this happens before the wrath. But the description of the fall of Babylon, which confuses people, is a little bit further on in Revelation 18. But it's put here to let you know that this is when it's destroyed, at the rise of the Antichrist, at destroying Babylon just before he sets himself up to be God in the temple, and the mark happens. This is the timing of it. And I wanted to make that clear, that it's in the days of the trumpet, right? And that Babylon is not God, and the Antichrist sets up a new religion so that they worship him, right? And Daniel talks extensively on that. And let's have a quick look at Nahan, and at the fall of Nineveh, Babylon makes a reference to wanton harlot, mistress of sorceries, city of blood, right? This place grows rich on the merchants of the earth. In Nahan, it enslaved the nations by her prostitution, and we know prostitution is an allegory for another religion, and with witchcraft, and fire is consumed by fire from grasshoppers, locusts, and the Assyrian again. Like, how beautiful does that come together from Nahan? It's exactly pretty much what Revelation talks about. But what it does do is it connects the imagery. We have locusts and grasshoppers, and we have the Assyrian at the time of the abomination. And just a quick mention on what they do to describe Babylon. Babylon is sort of understood in a series of allegories from the past, because this city wasn't there, is my understanding, at that time. So they used Babylon and Tyre and Nineveh to describe it, right? So Tyre was this great city of trade. So will Babylon be. Babylon was this significant religion at the time of Nimrod, which is also, I like to refer to the Antichrist as the new Nimrod, because he was an Antichrist-like figure. And is also possibility for possessing the Antichrist or rising again in one of the streams as we go through on that. And also Atlantis, because you may not know, but Atlantis and Babylon in mythologies are connected. And in the new age of Atlantis, and Atlantis was the capital city of the antediluvian world in mythology, and that's what they're trying to create, because these secret societies and mysticism, they want the end time. They want it. They call it the New Age, the New Atlantis. It's a 1,000-year reign that is a forgery of the true millennium, and they believe they can win. So they want to bring on the day of destiny. We need to understand that. And they believe that Lucifer is the equal of God. So a little bit more about the destruction of Babylon. And in Jeremiah, we see the spirit of the destroyer rising against Babylon. Wow, that's an interesting term. The spirit of a destroyer against Babylon. And as with a swarm of locusts, so we get another marker here. A destroyer comes against Babylon. And then Jeremiah, 50:51, again, that lines up so well with Revelation 18 on the destruction of Babylon. But it's this imagery that is so perfect in the timing and the definition of what's going on. And you just got to note that destroyer. And I'm going to explain that a little bit as we go here. Well, what do you know in Jeremiah? Lift up a banner. Blow the trumpet. The banner is Jesus, seen around the earth. The trumpet is blown. This is the days of the trumpet. What do you know? It says it right together in one verse. Send up horses like a swarm of locusts. Again, we're getting the same descriptions at the same time, all neatly dovetailing together. Isaiah 18:3. I just love this one. And the reason is, I'm just going to catch up on my cards. Is that you have not only a banner raised, but a trumpet sounds. And what's really interesting about this is the land of whirring wings. Right? This is a land that is crisscrossed by rivers. This is a land that sends ambassadors around the earth. This is a land of Cush that they call it, but Cush has a few different meanings as you dig back into it, so don't let that. It's beyond the rivers of Cush. Okay? And at a time when the harvest happens. Again, we know what the harvest is. It's the end time. I believe this is the prophecy that really speaks to the U.S. at the time when the trumpet sounds. And there are so many Israelites, I believe, that will wake up in the U.S. that will be part of the second Exodus. But understand that the U.S. is, I believe this is a verse that is talking specifically about the U.S. Okay, let's move back to who is the spirit of the destroyer. Okay, and we're going to talk about Revelation 9, and we talk about Abaddon and Apollyon, and it means destroyer. We just learned that whoever destroys Babylon is the spirit of the destroyer. It's the spirit of the Assyrian. Okay? And it's interesting that in the days of the trumpet, we have Abaddon or Apollyon that means destroyer. Okay? Now, what got me about that is how many other times is destroyer and Abaddon linked in the Bible? And I found in 3 times it's there. In every application, it's capitalized. And destruction's alternative notation translation is Abaddon. And I thought, well, that's rather interesting. And again, all of it comes out of Job again, because again, Job defines so much in what we need to know about what goes on in the rest of the Bible. It's really a terrific read. So when we look at the destroyer coming out of the abyss, and a destroyer that has an imprint on the Assyrian and is part of the destruction of Babylon, and we know that that's an Antichrist, we know there's a connection there. Okay, and who is in the abyss? Well, they put in fallen angels there, the Watchers, the impassioned angels who copulated to create Nephilim and the Nephilim world order. And I think the descendants of the Nephilim are going to be these 10 leaders at the end time. And I also think the Antichrist will have the bloodlines of a Nephilim. And if you believe the Gnostics, will have the bloodlines of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. I'll touch on that a little bit later. And I also think that he's going to be possessed. So I think there's a connection here with what we're building towards. And so the fallen angels are in there, and demons are in there. And demons, so it could be, again, a possibility that if I'm right, that it's not a fallen angel, Azazel, who I'm going to make a case for as one possibility. It could be an ex-Nephilim, a bodily spirit of a Nephilim, as to what David was talking about. And I know the Antichrist is a lot like Nimrod. I'm not necessarily a fan of that, but I don't rule it out either. So what I do know is demons can possess, and in certain applications, the Watchers have the ability, and certainly seraphims. If we look at a seraphim possessing an animal in Eden, the serpent, as what David was talking about, it could be either or. So it could be a king, or it could be an empire, or it could be a fallen angel possessing, or it could be a demon possessing, but it's all interconnected with the Antichrist. And as we piece this information together, I think we're going to get closer to resolving that. But Azazel is the leader of the Watchers. He is the king. He is the one that is charged for destroying and corrupting the antediluvian world. So he's a very, very strong candidate. And he is the leader over the demons. And then when we look at Revelation 17, we know there's a connection here in the abyss, whether it's a demon, whether it as a Nephilim demon when I talk about demons, or a fallen angel, or it's Nimrod. Doesn't really matter. We know it's a he, so it could be a king, or it could be a king over an empire of that time, because Daniel talks about empires. The beast which you saw once was, now is not, will come up out of the abyss and go to his destruction. And when he does come, the beast who once was, now is not, is an eighth king. And that's a reflection of the Antichrist overthrowing Babylon, overthrowing 3 of the 10 empires, probably the Western democracies, to redistribute the plunder, because we're the wealthiest nations on the earth. So our trading bloc is going to be one of the ones that are going to be plundered. And he now sets himself as that eighth king, or that eighth king of the eighth empire, however you want to interpret that, and is the destroyer. Either the destroyer with the Assyrian as the destroyer of Babylon, or the destroyer as Abaddon. You pick your poison, but there's going to be a relationship there. And when we look back at Enoch, deep into the book of Enoch, because it is a rather large book, what we look at there is that the punishment of the fallen angels is by archangels, right? Okay, so, and they're punished in the abyss of fire at the end. So when we look at what's going on with Enoch, all I'm doing here is to understand that these are talking mostly about angels that are in the abyss, and that archangels are going to be required to actually do the final punishment on them. So I've covered a lot of material, and I've got a small piece to do at the end, but I just wanted to open it up a little bit to some questions, or if I lost people. I know it's a lot of information and a lot of verses, and what I'm trying to do is just show you the theme and create that curiosity for you to go and search out yourself. But if you've got some questions, let's talk about this, because I'm going to move in a little different direction. Yes?
Some of the verses that speak of the spirit of destroyer, I didn't write down.
Okay, come see me after the presentation.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Pardon me? No, this is, there's themes of this, but my book is not this much detail about the days of the trumpet. but I will allude to it. Yes.
Have you looked into any information? I've been looking into some of this. It's interesting that mentions Assyria so much as you just shown us of their relation with the Germanic tribes, blonde hair, blue eyed thing,
Yeah.
even the Nazi, even the Pope, and things like that.
Yeah.
You know, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so I mean the Nazis believe that they go back through the Assyrians, back to the Aryans, back to the time of Atlantis that they would call in their occultist system Thule. And the Thule Society housed the real of the blood ideology and the Volkish ideology that also overlaid the Grail and the bloodlines of Jesus and a whole bunch of other things into this sort of cauldron of variation of theosophy, and they actually called it Ariosophy because it went rogue from what the original theosophy was. And if people don't know who created theosophy, that was the Rosicrucians from Gnosticism. Okay, so yes, they take their lineage back to Assyrians, back to Scythians, back to Aryans, and the blonde and blue-eyed version as opposed to the red-haired and green-eyed version. So the Nordic one, which goes to where they're from. Yes?
So you were saying Babylon is separate from the Assyrian entity and
Yes.
the whole government and the 10 kingdoms that are under the Assyrian, and the Assyrian destroys Babylon to
Yes.
plunder Babylon.
Yeah, because they become jealous of the wealth, right? And what is going to happen, according to Inside Secret Society writings, is Babylon will impose a tribute on every transaction that takes place in the world. We call that a value-added tax. You may have heard that. Canada, we call it the GST. So it will take a tribute, so to speak, on every business transaction in the world and will grow very wealthy. So it is a city, it is a religion, and it is a trade center. And it rides the beast, and it rides all of the beasts of history because it is the religion that controls the empire. And that is why not only the wealth but the control that the 10 kings will conspire with the Antichrist to overthrow it in one day.
So you were drawing a parallel between the United States,
Mhm.
and then you also said Babylon as a city.
Yes,
So is Babylon a particular city, or will it be a nation, United
City.
States-wide kind of thing?
all the Old Testament prophecies call it a city, and Revelation calls it a city. So we know it's going to be a city. And it also says it's going to be on 7 hills or 7 mountains, depending on which translation you are. And I know a lot of people don't want to call it Rome, but in the time of the writing of the Bible, they used a code that they called Pesher, right? So that you couldn't speak against Rome. So if you said anything about Rome, you had to use a code, and that code was Babylon for Rome. Okay, so I'm not saying that's 100%, but that's one possibility of why they use Babylon. But they also use Babylon because it's the religion of Nimrod. And that's the religion of these empires that are married to this Babylonian type of religion, this mysticism that partners with an Antichrist type figure, right? But it is also a city of trade, and it is also a city. And the Vatican is its own state, right? And when we look at the end time religion, it has to grow to incorporate all religions. It has to be this umbrella universal religion, right? Because she sits on many waters, right? And it has to have a look like a Christian religion because it's got two horns like a lamb, but it speaks like a dragon. Okay? That language is not coincidental. So something has to brew within Christianity and it has to fall, right? And the likelihood it starts with in Rome, and it's already down the path, especially with the Mary apparitions. And I believe out of Medjugorje, the 3 children that were initiated into the woman who described as exactly what is in Revelation 12, if you dig into Medjugorje and the initiation, they will come out at the proper time, and they will give 10 warnings for the whole world to convert to the one universal religion, and they will give 10 warnings. And after each warning, some sort of destruction will happen. And people out of fear will start to come in. And then you've got all these other miracles, and it's just going to take over Christianity first the Roman Church, then the rest of the people who are not strong in the faith within Protestantism, and then all the other religions of the world.
What was that?
My conclusion.
What was the three children again?
Medjugorje, in the former Yugoslavia. Medjugorje. Okay, look it up. It's very interesting. I've got a few books on it. It is absolutely spectacular in terms of if you're a prophecy buff. Any other questions? Medjugorje. Medjugorje. Yes.
So the Bible mentions like most of the Nephilim, how they were men of renown.
Yep.
known.
Yep.
And then the Bible also says Nimrod, when he was born, he later became a man of renown. So was he like born normal, but through genetics somehow?
Yeah, and he's also listed in the Table of Nations as being the son of Cush and coming from Ham. And anybody who's listed in the Table of Nations is not likely to be a descendant of Noah, unless it's the third option that somehow either the wives or some of the sons carried Nephilim DNA or were Nephilim, and it's one of the possibilities. But my understanding is when I look at people who are in the Old Testament that are listed as nations and they're not listed in the Table of Nations, those are the Nephilim. It would be the Rephaites, like from Rapha. It would be Arba from Anak. It would be Seir. It would be all of these other peoples. And even if you've got some other peoples in there that are very, very strange, like the Kenites and the Kenizzites, who don't come out of the Table of Nations, and they link themselves back to Cain. So one wonders how that happens, and I kind of link that to one of the possibilities that more people survive the flood than what you think. And you'll have to read my book to say that, as that is one of the options. And I understand that all three options are possible, second incursion. And again, if you look at, let's say, just for one example, if you look at Enkidu and Gilgamesh and Ziusudra or Upnapishtim, we're talking about all demigods and their survival and giants of the flood. And Enkidu was created after the flood to offset the evilness of Gilgamesh, right? And then Ziusudra was this archetypical Nephilim demigod, and so was his family that were loaded on the Sumerian version of the ark to repopulate the earth. So it looks like a similar story at the macro level, but the devil is in the details, right, so to speak. And they're describing, at least from a polytheist perspective, survival of giants and a possible second incursion. And the Gnostics also believe a second incursion happened at Sodom and Gomorrah, which is one of the reasons for the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. So you got three possibilities. Somehow they survived. But I kind of look at it, if they aren't listed coming from the Table of Nations, or their descendants stop at a certain point, like Nimrod doesn't show any descendants, something changed. They probably moved in with and dwelled with the giants and probably reproduced hybrid giants by marrying Nephilim. What we do know is giants are before and after the flood. There's only three ways of doing it. You have to pick your poison on that one. Okay, moving on. One more, sorry.
What would you say with the Ten Kingdoms being related to the European Union?
That was a popular thought in the 80s and 90s. I would say my opinion is no, and most people have had to recant that because it's grown so much. And I go with 10 groups of nations. And I'll go to this and say that even as you see the EEC today, that's going to split. Right? So it's going to be two. And it's going to be two different groups of those groups of nations. One dominated by Germany, one dominated by England and France, likely. And again, that sort of fits if you look at Roman empires and Holy Roman empires and things like that. So. Okay, exposing some darkness. And I want to talk a little bit about Freemasonry and the creation of the King James Bible. And I want to first of all say that, you can pick this up anywhere at Amazon. This is not one that I think there's another one on. But what I wanted to talk about was the time of King James was a very interesting time because Elizabeth had died, no heirs, and here comes a Stuart king, Catholic, and the Catholics were no longer in power. And you also have Presbyterians who have no organizational structure, and they're looking to benefit from power. You've got the Puritans that want more reforms. You've got the Anglican Church that wants to remain in power. You've got the Roman Catholic Church that wants back in power. And you've got Parliament wanting more power. And you've got the Quakers going on. So you got this whole thing that King James comes in. And he does something rather unique, right? He creates the King James Bible, right? And everybody uses it. And so he sort of brings the religious sort of aspects together by doing it. Now, there's some concerns about that, but I think it's quite significant accomplishment. And I know of two other ones where they took that kind of principle. And one would be Constantine. And he homogenized the Christian religion with mysticism or Mithricism, right? And also you see a lot of iconography in especially the Catholic Church and even into Protestant Church to a certain degree of the Egyptian sort of pictures. And again, you see the typical Isis and Horus pictures of the baby Jesus, and you got the halos. And so he brought sun worship and monotheism together in one religion to cross all borders and to unite the kingdom like glue. And he took that from Parthians with Zoroastrian and King Shakur, as I remember, and he brought that empire together by bringing Zoroastrian, which is the same religion as Mithricism and Gnosticism. It's just an older form, right? So he did something that I think he learned from history because he would have been very, very, very well educated. But such a great accomplishment. So I don't want to be too hard on him. And the history of the King James Bible is that it was first discussed at a conference, as it says up there in Hampton Court, and was translated in 1607 and then completed in 1610 and or 1611, and I'll explain that in a second. But let's just, so we understand who King James was. He was King James the First of England, the Sixth of Scotland. He's a Stuart king. He is part of the Unicorn dynasty. He's part of the Merovingian bloodline. He is the most ennobled house of Rexdu, the Priory of Sion, of secret societies. They took the colors of Judah and Israel, of green and gold. Okay? And they are one of the families that are likely to present the Antichrist with the pedigrees. Okay? And they link all the way back into prehistory. This is a significant dynasty, even though they did the King James Bible. And we know he was a Freemason. And a lot of people say that he isn't, but he was. And he was part of the Lodge of Scone. And in the West Hall of Perth number 3, there's a mural as well at the Lodge of Scone. And it's called The Mutual Agreement. And it's a picture of James's initiation into Freemasonry. And we have the date of his initiation from April 15th, 1601. 1601. Quite a coincidence. When he comes from Scotland, where Freemasonry is, to London to be king, and 60 years later we have the creation of the Royal Society and the charter issued by another Stuart. And if you don't know who created the Royal Society, that was created by Rosicrucians and Freemasons. And they created it to get control of education away from the church and to brainwash people and to honor Lucifer by developing the sciences and using that to discredit Christianity and to build monuments to the great architect of the universe. So just a couple of quick connections there for you. All of that's in the book. So Okay, so we covered off who he was, and who did he use to commission it? Well, according to the Freemasons, 47 scholars were collected of the greatest piety and learning. But back then, who was people who were of the greatest piety and learning? Yeah, it was the nobles and the Freemasons and the Jesuits and the Cistercians and the Benedictine nuns, Benedictine monks. And if you don't know who the Cistercians are, they're the precursor of the Jesuits and were active in developing within the Catholic Church the 7 sacred sciences, right? This liberal arts, this liberal philosophy. And again, if you don't know anything about the 7 sacred sciences, buy my book. It's in there. And I'll explain it in great detail because it has a big part of the antediluvian world. A couple things on it. It was completed in 1610 to 1611. It was translated from the oldest manuscript versions and studying from Greek, Latin, Hebrew, Chaldean translations, and originally included the Apocrypha. And the Catholic Bible still has the Apocrypha, by the way. And first published with Masonic symbols in 1610 on the cover. And that met with some resistance, so they took that off in 1611. That's why it's not on there, and I wanted to show you. They might have had a few more than that on it, but I don't know. But that's how it first came out. And what's really interesting is the King James Version was probably guided by, if it wasn't written by Freemasons, it was certainly guided and edited by people in the background, because there's another purpose that they had for developing it. Not that it diminishes the work that they did, but there was a reason for it. And so it was partially developed to do a transition for Freemasonry from the old charges, which were basically oral charges. Okay? It was going to be sort of their new sort of constitution and belief system. Well, that's interesting because you don't really see that in the King James Version that we have. So they wanted to move away from operative to speculative because it was being dominated by the nobles and the elites by that point in time. And so they utilized in this process what they call their polychronicon. And this is all of their oral transitions, oral traditions written down. And I think they created a larger Bible that they use at the adept and higher levels around the King James Bible. Because, you get information in some of, when you're reading about some of the great sort of speakers from Masonry, and I know they'll say something that's in the King James Bible. I'll look it up because I don't recall it being there, and I can't find it. And one example, because it relates to the book, and I'll use that just so you know what I'm talking about, is that when we talk about Goliath and being from Gath and coming from four giants came from Gath. And in the King James Version, it says they came from one giant. In other traditions, they came from Rapha. But what Masons say is he's a descendant of one giant named Og. And I can't find that in the King James Bible, no matter how I look at 2 Samuel 21:22, which they reference. So I think they have additional information. And that makes sense when you look at how they look at the Bible. And the Bible is utilized not only from the standard Bible, but also from the oral traditions. They use the King James as a platform, as additional evidence on some of their most significant patriarchs. Okay? Some of those significant patriarchs are Noah, because they recognize him as crossing the flood. And in some of their traditions, he's not the Noah we know, but that comes from the Gnostic side of the religion. Cain, Abel, Enoch, the evil, Tubal-Cain, Tower of Babel. These are key stories for Freemasonry. And they as I said earlier, they take their organization back to the start of Genesis, and with Genesis 6 and the 7 sacred sciences and mysticism, and they look at Enoch, the evil son of Cain, not son of Jared, from the Seth line, because there's two. They look at evil Enoch as being one of the main patriarchs, and they look at Tubal-Cain as being one of the highest artificers of metals and one of the great patriarchs of the antediluvian epoch, and they like to use a lot of symbology of Tubal-Cain. Typically, you're going to have a stick or a crossover and two balls, and so it represents a cane and two balls. So if you see Tubal-Cain, so if you see that as part of rings and jewelry, they like to sort of wear that. They take their history right back there. And they also believe in the oral traditions that two pillars survived the flood. And again, there's more meaning to the two pillars of Boaz and Joachim that's in the temples. It's got a lot to do with these two pillars, because that held the secrets to the seven sacred sciences that were discovered by Hermes and Nimrod, that helped them to do Babel and to build the city and build the tower, as an example of the fifth science, which is geometry, also known as masonry. So we're talking about building, right? And so that was their first manifestation. And what's significant about that is that they attribute Nimrod as writing the first constitution of the post-diluvian epoch of the Masonic Society, and he was the first Grand Master at Babel of Freemasonry. So this is significant. They have all this other additional information that they wanted to write down and take away from the oral charges, so which is kind of one of the reasons why I think there's an additional Bible and why they wanted to have the King James Version written, that they've added onto for their own selves. And they believe in the biblical references to building and architecture to testify in the Bible to their great architect, God of the universe, right? So everything that's in the Bible, whether it's the temple for building or Babel for building or any sort of monument, or the second one, and they will draft Jerubbaal as part of the Masonic Society and the Temple of the Cross that goes all the way back. They will use these as evidence testifying to their great architect. But you have to understand is that this is not what they're married to. But they did take something where they used to write down the oaths and have to log it, and then they've added at that time swearing on the Bible, so you see that in court. This is at the time when they introduced the King James Bible as a time to take care of the oathing in the Masonic lodges, and we see that carried on today. So it has permeated our society like so much other things that they have done. So Freemasonry doesn't accept the Bible as their theology, only as additional evidence, as I talked about. They believe the Bible has a multiplicity of meanings. What do I mean by that? They believe that the standard narrative is meaningless. It's just there as hiding the real story. And so they believe in the allegorical approach. Okay? So when you hear of allegory, that's Gnosticism. That's symbolism, and that's learning of these mysteries and these secret symbolisms and allegories, and they apply that to the Bible. So they look at how we interpret the Bible literally as being totally wrong and totally evil. And that's how one of the things that they do to usurp the Bible. And so they also believe that the Bible also represents, figuratively speaking, all the Bibles of the world. So that if you could have Islam, or you could have Hinduism, or pick any religion that you want, there's scripture, and it's interchangeable, right? They believe in this universality of a religion, which is just another allegory for a universal religion of a polytheist design, because they are Gnostics in secret societies. They are polytheists. And they believe the Bible has and holds in it, with these allegories, mysteries, and certain mysteries that, again, that they can learn and teach the adepts as they go forward. And what's really kind of interesting, am I running out of time? Pretty close? Okay, I'll wind it up pretty quick, is so many of the presidents in the United States, they like to use the Masonic Bible to be sworn in on. It's called the St. John's Bible. And I think that's the expanded Bible that I'm talking about. And some of them will hold two Bibles, one in each hand. One will be the St. John's Bible or a Masonic Bible, and one will be the standard King James Bible. But so look for that when presidents are swearing in. Okay, now they also utilize some key phrases that they like to have their initiates learn about in the Bible. And in Job, we talk about man born of a woman. And so a man lies down and does not rise, that he sleeps. That once you're dead, right? They're going to use that for a reason within the allegories. Okay, and I'm going to move through this very quickly. And another one that they use is Matthew 27. And I highlighted, they spit on him, and they met a man from Cyrene named Simon, and they forced him to carry the cross. And that's an allegory that Jesus didn't die on the cross. And they spit on him comes out of Templarism, that part of the initiation, they were to spit on the cross. And part of the rule of the order, I think number 6, as my memory recalls, is that, it says that if anybody, including princes and priests, knew the real story, they wouldn't believe in the cross, in Jesus. They would throw it away. So I'm building on something here in terms of the allegory. Look, this is another one that I used, and they use it in other writings, but not highlighted, certainly from what they say to pay attention to from this one. But it says, Pilate was surprised to hear that he had already died because it was just a few hours, right? So they use that one as a setup to where they're going here. And I also underline that when they rolled the stone against the entrance, Mary Magdalene was there, and that's important for them as well. Okay, in Matthew 27, it talks about, we remember that he was still alive, he said that he was going to rise, and they called him a deceiver, so they like that. So that's one of the reasons why it's highlighted. And so that they were going to have this stone put in front of it so that they couldn't fake a resurrection, right? So you can see what we're building to here. And notice it also, they like this one because it describes how Jesus was wrapped in the linen. So that's very important in terms of the Shroud of Turin to their belief system. And a lot of people, I'm not sure about it, but they think that the Shroud of Turin is going to be used to clone the Antichrist. I'm not sure about that, but some people do believe that. So, and it's a possibility with technology. But what they're building towards is that Jesus didn't die on the cross, right? That he survived to Mary Magdalene. Right? And you hear this, whether it's Da Vinci Code, History Channel, this is what the Gnostics believe. That he had at least 3 children. One, Josephus, went on to continue the bloodline. That's the bloodlines encoded in the Holy Grail. And then that split off with Amenemhab to the Merovingian dynasty. And so they're going to link the Antichrist not only back to Nephilim in their belief system, I believe they're going to link it back to allegedly the bloodlines of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. And it's not important to know that I believe that, because I don't. And I know you don't believe that. That's not what's important. What's important is they believe it. And they're going to try and destroy Christianity, right? And as Paul said, if the resurrection is false and is a hoax, then our religion is a lie. So they have to do 2 things. They have to take away the resurrection, and because Paul wrote so much of the New Testament, they have to discredit him. And if you're into any of the Qumran documents and the Dead Sea Scrolls that talk about the teacher of righteousness and the evil liar, they call Paul the evil liar. And they will wage war on him in the end time to destroy Paul's credibility, because they believe that it's only his writings that raised Jesus to a deity status, to the Son of God, to the Word of God, and they need to destroy that, as well as the belief in the resurrection, and that Christianity will fall. And they also use this one with the doubting Thomas to touch the physical body of Jesus, and they will use that to say he wasn't dead. He had wounds, yes, but he was taken off the cross before he died, right? And this other guy bared his cross, okay? And what's just as important is this one, is near the cross was Mary Magdalene and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby. And they connect their belief that the disciple Jesus loved was Mary Magdalene, and that they were married at Bethany and survived later to have children. Now, if you read on when you were talking about this in terms of the disciple Jesus loved, they do specifically say he, but they ignore that, of course, right? They only pick out what they want. So how they're going to try and attack us is take away our core beliefs. So I just wanted to bring that about because that's what Babylon is all about, and brings about this universal religion and starts within Christianity, has to totally bring it down but not totally destroy it, because it has to reshape it, because it's got to have the two horns like a lamb but speak like a dragon. And they're going to attack the resurrection. You need to keep that in mind. So I know I threw a lot of information at you guys today, but I'm hoping I connected some dots, and if you like dots connected, you're going to like my book.
Would you take some questions?
Yes, I'll take some questions. Yep.
Gary's going to stay up. He's going to take some questions from you. We're going to take about a 15, 20-minute break. Get some food. John said we can't keep it till Tabernacle, so we got to eat it tonight. So go ahead and take 15 minutes. Ask some questions. Gary's going to stand up and answer your questions while you got them. So go right ahead. It's all yours.
I got one.
Yep.
At the beginning, you in this particular segment, you mentioned Constantine
Yep.
and his mysticism,
Yes.
blending that with Christianity.
Yep.
How would you relate that mysticism portion to Kabbalah?
How would I associate that with Kabbalism? Yeah, so I mean the Jewish Kabbalism has several sort of aspects of it, you know, from the Johannites to Simon the Magus and the Essenes, right? So it is essentially the same religion, and so under sort of the Gnostic religion and Manichaeism, all of this is absorbed under one even back then. So even though it has a couple of different flavors, it's still part of the same sort of homogenization that Constantine was trying to do. And if you don't know about the Essenes, they were distinctly polytheist. The Essenes, the people of, yes. And even though they were the third part of the three religions, the Sadducees and the Pharisees, they believed in their most sacred book was the Book of Jubilees, which is written by Enoch the Evil, at least that's what they believe, son of Cain. And they believe in the fallen angels, and they worship those angels. And these are the people that Ezekiel describes going to the temple in the morning dressed in white, which they did, and faced east and worshiped Tammuz. Essenes believe that they connect back to Heliopolis, and that the original religion of monotheism was tainted and is not the original religion of Moses. So Moses is very, very high in their belief system, and they believe that Moses brought with him the mysteries that he learned at Heliopolis. And that part makes some sense, not that this is true, because as being adopted into the Egyptian royal family as a child, he would have been educated. He would have been educated in the mysteries, right? And so he believes that's the religion that was brought, or the Essenes believe that that was the religion that was brought back that went rogue. And the true religion of the Israelites should be polytheism.
So the Essenes are not connected with the Dead Sea Scrolls and the collection of the Torah and the
They are connected with the Dead Sea Scrolls. I mean, the Qumran community is the sort of the apocalyptic, monastic sort of contingent of the Essenes, but they also had representation on the council. And out of the Dead Sea Scrolls, that's where you get the teacher of righteousness and the evil liar.
I find it fascinating that you said that they were discrediting Paul. There was this whole movement of people who say that Paul is a false prophet.
Yes.
So we're talking Freemasons here.
Yeah. So at at the rise of Christianity, there were two sets of gospels and two types of gods being preached, and that's what Paul speaks to, right? And so a lot of the Gnostic gospels were destroyed, or at least that's what the Catholic Church tried to do at around 500, but a lot survived. So when you hear about the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, you talk about the Gospel of Judah, the Gospel of Thomas, and on and on and on and on. There's so many of them. These are what they say are surviving Gospels of the other faction of Christianity that did not recognize Jesus as a God. They recognized Jesus as a prophet like Zoroaster or Buddha or Muhammad and just one of the enlightened peoples that came along, and that the resurrection was a hoax. So they looked at him as mortal and as a prophet. And so when you hear some people saying that they're Christians, they're just not saying a lot of times that they're Gnostic Christians.
What about the timing of the Parousia with the second Exodus?
The timing of what? I didn't hear that.
Parousia,
Explain that to me, please.
the second coming.
Oh, the second coming, yeah. Well, I thought I did.
I mean, I don't understand.
I don't understand the correlation between the two.
Doesn't see a correlation?
You're saying that the second coming and the
Yeah. So,
second Exodus are the same
so
time,
yeah.
then the second coming is the time of the rapture.
Okay, so the rapture happens at the midpoint, just as the Exodus does. Okay. At the time of the abomination, shortly thereafter. They're two separate events, but they're at the same time when Jesus makes his first coming back, right? And then he comes back again to defeat the armies, right? Now he's still probably down here with the Israelites, I suppose, at the second Exodus protecting him. There's not much detail on that. Well, no, he's there. He comes, right? Yeah, there's three comings if you talk the first one as being born from Mary, right? Okay, and then the second coming is the time of Exodus and rapture, and then he comes for Armageddon too. Comes on the white horse and defeats the armies of the Antichrist. Yeah, the days of the Lord. It's not singular; it's plural. Yeah. Well, they wanted to move away from the oral tradition, so they wanted to have sort of one unified book that would have that written down. They just don't give that to the lower levels, right? They just give them the standard King James version with a few pages in the front that, pretty much anybody can get from Amazon. But they have significant information. And when I wrote the book, I used a lot of this information that comes out of the Legends of Freemasonry, the Legends of the Craft by Albert Mackey. And it has just... I don't know how many stories are in there about their history, but that is the old charges.